Okay, so as I mentioned, tonight we're going to be exploring from the New Deal to World War II, which is going to really capitalize on the last two objectives for Unit 2. We'll be talking specifically about what the government did to address the Great Depression, starting with the administration of Herbert Hoover, and then talking about the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then from there, we'll be extrapolating on how and why America is going to move from isolationist to interventionist in the World War II era. For your second test, you'll be tackling one of these three essential questions. The first one looks at the progressive era between 1890 and 1920, addressing the political, economic, and social ills of the country and how successfully the progressive response was to these issues. And then the second part is going to take a look at the elements of the Roaring Twenties and how they contributed to the Depression and what the government initially did to address this crisis, emphasis here on during the Hoover administration. So the documents that you looked at this past week and the discussion that you participated in is going to be examined for this essay question, and then you're going to specifically talk about the response during the Hoover administration. And then the third question is looking specifically at the administration of FDR and how he steps up once inaugurated in March of 1933 to address the crisis. And we'll also be looking there about how his program is going to succeed or not succeed. And that's going to be part of our work this evening. So again, make sure that you are carefully reading the prompt when you tackle one of these three essays. And if you have questions as we go through this content tonight, just let me know. So to start out, we're going to take a look at this brief video, which focuses really on the Hoover administration and the Great Depression.
Hey everybody, Eric Bennett from HGTV's Desert Flippers. And if you live in the Harrisonburg area, mention the name Herbert Hoover, the 31st president of the United States, and you probably think Great Depression. Here's how the usual narrative goes. The stock market crashes in October of 1929. Hoover, a Republican, refuses to intervene. Instead, he lets the free market deal with the problem, and the economic downturn morphs into a catastrophic decline. Well, the stock market did crash in 1929, and the economic downturn that followed did lead into the Great Depression. But it wasn't because Hoover was a small government man like his predecessor, Calvin Coolidge. It was just the opposite. My research shows that it was Hoover's incessant meddling, not the mistaken view that he did nothing, that provoked the Great Depression. Hoover, a good man with magnanimous instincts, was a successful mining engineer before he got into government. He believed that almost anything could be engineered, and he brought that philosophy to the economic crisis of 1929. As a result, he was the wrong man for the job at exactly the wrong time. For starters, Hoover distrusted the free market. He knew that unfettered competition forces companies to reduce prices. But he believed lower prices lead to lower wages. In November of 1929, shortly after the stock market swoon, Hoover called a meeting with the CEOs of major American industry. Henry Ford of Ford Motor, Alfred Sloan of GM, and Pierre DuPont of DuPont Chemicals led the group that met with Hoover. The president set down a very clear and unprecedented directive. 1, despite the weakening economy, keep wage rates at current levels. 2, minimize layoffs. If you must reduce manpower, do it through work sharing. That is, have 2 workers work half a day each or every other day. In return for maintaining wage rates and sharing jobs, Hoover promised the CEOs that he would convince workers to neither strike nor demand additional pay or benefits. He kept his promise. Labor agreed not to strike. Industry agreed not to cut wages. In fact, Henry Ford raised wages as a gesture of solidarity. The engineering scene had engineered the perfect solution, only it didn't work. As 1929 moved into 1930 and 1931, prices for industrial goods declined. One reason was the economy-wide deflation brought on by the Federal Reserve's tight money policy. People simply didn't have money to buy goods or invest in companies. But another reason, and a big one, was the result of something else Hoover did, his signing of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. That act, which raised tariffs on imports to the highest levels in 100 years, led America's trading partners to retaliate by placing tariffs on American goods. With American exports cut in half, the prices of American industrial goods declined sharply. As the Depression deepened, industry asked Hoover for permission to cut wages, but Hoover refused. If we cut wages, there will be hell to pay with unions, he said. By the end of 1931, with the economy in shambles, industry broke their deal by cutting wages and increasing layoffs. But it was too late to stop the free fall. Business failure built on business failure. Unemployment soared from 3.2% in 1929 to 23.6% in 1932. Hoover countered by vastly increasing government spending, offering a 9-point plan that included major public works projects like the Hoover Dam and the Los Angeles Aqueduct. He raised taxes on the top income bracket from 25% to 63%. He did everything he could think of to engineer the economy back to health, except the one thing that might have worked: let the free market heal itself. What should have been a couple of hard years turned into a decade-long disaster. What of the commonly held view that Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt's economic policies were so different? You can now see that view is also inaccurate. Both Hoover and FDR believed in forceful government intervention into the economy. I'm Lee Ohanian, professor of economics at UCLA for Prager University.
So that little piece shows us that, much of the criticism towards Hoover regarding the Great Depression is often misguided. Hoover actually intervened far more than a fiscal conservative would have done, and actually came under fire from his own political party for that intervention. They still did decide to nominate Hoover for another term. And in the election of 1932, he did stage an attempt to beat the Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a very experienced politician, one could say, hailing from New York. FDR is the fourth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. And other than the same family name, honestly, they don't have a whole ton in common. They came from very different political viewpoints. But they also did have in common their personalities. Like Teddy, FDR was a very charismatic individual. He was somebody who came across to the public when he would speak to them as being very affable and charming. And also, despite the fact that he came from an incredibly wealthy New York family, the fact that he had been stricken with polio oftentimes helped him connect with the average people because he too had struggles. And all of these things put together, combined with the grueling campaign that Roosevelt embarked upon, blaming Hoover for the Depression, blaming Hoover for not wanting to tackle the tough issues that were happening at this time, he manages to defeat Hoover in the election of 1932. His confidence was uplifting. He was calling for the repeal of prohibition, which by that time was being viewed as a pretty abject failure. And he really manages to win both the hearts and the minds of the American people. In one of the popular culture events of this decade, FDR's inauguration is filmed with audio and will be available to viewers throughout the nation via newsreel. It's 1933. Most people couldn't even afford a television had they existed, and of course that technology has not yet emerged. But the president can reach Americans in the form of a newsreel. And so Americans at that point in history would go to the theaters and they would view films that the talkies had emerged really during the previous decade. and they would view films. And prior to the film starting, there would be a set, instead of movie trailers, you would actually get news. And this is going to be the main delivery of visual news until the television set really becomes a much more popular staple in the American household in the 1950s, which we'll explore next week. Of course, newspapers are still the most predominant source of news. I should have said audiovisual news for the newsreels. And then radio, of course, is going to simply be the audio delivery of it. Question?
Yes. Actually.
Okay.
So there were some prototype television sets in the 1920s. The issue was they didn't have a lot of range, like you couldn't send
I should say contemporary television
yeah, contemporary
sets did
television
not
sets.
exist.
And not
Yes.
only that, their screens actually weren't much bigger than this. And the images they gave were very grainy,
Yes.
very
Yeah.
poor quality, but they did exist.
So not something that the average consumer was
Would
going to
want.
want or have. Yes. So as we're listening to FDR's inaugural address, I want you guys to think about what he's saying. I want you to imagine yourself, either sitting in a theater watching this, within the weeks and days after the address has been given, or perhaps sitting aside your radio in your home. All right. We're now in the midst of the Depression. We have a new president. And just think about what he is saying, how he is saying it, and how it would possibly have made you feel had you lived at that time in history.
Give a teacher something they really need, a free trip. Now's your chance to show your appreciation. Visit VALottery.com/thankateacher to send a note to your favorite teacher through May 10th. The Virginia Lottery. Good fun for a great cause.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. These measures, or such other measures, as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall speak within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. This nation is asking for action, and action now. In this dedication of a nation, we humbly ask the blessing of God. May He protect each and every one of us. May He guide me in the days to come.
All right. So what is your perception You're in your living room, you're listening to this radio address, or you just, come out of the theater from seeing it in a newsreel. What is your perception?
It's a rather wonderful pep talk, but looking back on.
Well, no, you can't look back. You're just in the moment.
It's a wonderfully great pep talk, and in the moment, I would feel like, yeah, we're gonna get through this. We can work it out. We can keep going.
All right.
We have to keep going.
To me, you just sounded like a politician.
Okay. All right.
Typical
They
politician.
all sound the same.
Okay. Other thoughts?
It's encouraging the average person that's living in 1933 and it's a new president and they don't really know what they're getting into, and after Hoover they're like, oh, finally. It just seems like he had a good perspective on everything.
Fine. Finally, someone's going to do something.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Finally, somebody's going to do something. Another interesting pop culture side note about this inauguration is that it would be the last presidential election inauguration held in March. Following this inauguration, the 20th Amendment will be passed, which would actually move the presidential inauguration to January, making it much closer to the November election and thus ending the extensive lame duck period from which a president like Hoover is voted out of office and then still remains in office for another 4 months. And so when he comes into office in March, it's a really, very, very trying time in America. It is really at the peak of the Great Depression. Destitution and misery are spreading throughout the United States. 4/5 of all of the banks were closed. 80% of all of the banks in the nation had closed. And, he's got to quickly turn this ship around. He's got to have the American people regain their faith and regain their faith quickly, because fixing this situation without them is not going to happen. To set the stage a little bit further, I want to show you this additional little clip. It comes to us from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Oh, I guess I have to go right to the site because I didn't embed it, which also tells us a little bit more about America in 1933. So they were striking because they didn't agree with Hoover's shift sharing policy.
Let this good light tell me that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Right, so that's where the nation's at. And so that's the situation that Hoover needs to step up into. And he identifies right off the bat that he has 3 main challenges that he has to address. He needs to revive the economy in what is definitely one of the most ironic and iconic photographs ever taken in American history. We have a bread line set amidst the backdrop of a billboard proclaiming that America has the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And so Roosevelt's got to fix that. He's got to find a way to jumpstart the economy and move it forward to get this bread line and other situations like it eliminated, which goes into the second prong, relieving human misery. Also tied to human misery is the situation that is taking place on the Great Plains. As we're going to see a little bit later on tonight, in the 1930s, the Great Plains and its farm families find itself not only impacted, excuse me, by the Great Depression, but also impacted by the rise of the Dust Bowl. And so Roosevelt knows that he needs to step in and find a way to fix this. And so that's what he's going to do. It is upon these three major challenges that he crafts what will become known as his New Deal. The New Deal had three components: relief, recovery, and reform. The three components of the New Deal were relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, to provide Americans with immediate assistance, to help them with basic necessities in life, like food, employment, and direct monetary payments to allow these people to find ways to keep a roof over their heads. So relief is immediate assistance. How are we going to get food in their bellies, jobs, and if necessary, direct monetary payments to allow them to keep a roof over their heads? The second component of the New Deal is recovery. How are we going to promote growth? How are we going to revive the American economy to make sure that this upward trend will continue? And then the last component is reform. How are we going to fix our economic system, our governmental system, to ensure that this never happens again? So relief, relief, immediate assistance, direct monetary payments, literally food, employment opportunities to help people survive. Recovery, how are we going to revive the economy? How are we going to jumpstart it and promote growth? And then lastly, reform. How are we going to fix both the American economic system and the American government to ensure that something like this never happens again? So those are going to be the three components of the New Deal. Right now I'm passing out to you a packet. In this packet you are going to see 6 of the New Deal programs that existed, that came about, I should say, at this time. Maybe an extra there. There it is. You can pass it back to you. And then you can pass over to Haley and Ashton. All right, so starting with Kelsey, you guys can count off to 6 for me. 1, 2. Jimmy, you're 3.
No.
4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, Sean, 6.
2, 3.
Oh.
5.
Kate?
Oh, I'm 3.
Oh, you're 3. 6. And then 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so if you guys want to find the other people in your group, what you're going to do is you're going to take a look at your assigned item. And using this as a start, I want you to read about your program, fill out what you can, and then as a group, if you collectively need to find other information, feel free to use your resources to do that. Somebody in your group will likely have a smart device, but a lot of the basic information on here is available to you to help answer those questions. So, who are my ones? All right. So if ones want to gather with Sharon, we'll make Sharon move. So she's hacking up a long arrow there. All right. Our 2s. All right. Since there's a bunch of you down here, you guys can, Tracy, if you want to come down, and whoever our other 2 is, Tyler, come down here with Tara and Mackenzie. And Miranda. And then our 3s, who are my 3s, you guys can go over here to Megan. Our 4s, back to Ashton. 5s, down here with JT. And our 6s, back to Sean and Levi. All right.
Shimmy up single seats, all right.
Sure.
I won't be, I'll follow.
Yep.
I mean, you're using a computer. It's not, I can't get it. Yeah, to prepare for because he has to see. I was on it before, so I'm clicking it again. It's like, oh, you got to sign in, but it's not, the sign in thing isn't popping up. I'm not going to pop up. I don't know.
That happens occasionally, and I don't know why it happens.
Yeah, so I'm just like. Okay.
Found it National Recovery Administration.
So do you guys want to read each thing and then answer questions? You want to read the whole thing and then come up with questions?
I have.
So you only have to do your program.
Okay.
So whichever number you are, that's your program.
So
Yeah.
you do number 5.
Yes, ma'am.
Industrial crisis.
Fell. What's that?
Business failure.
Oh, I do. Okay. Sorry.
This was an attempt to. Regulate wages and prices and costs amongst themselves. I believe this would fall under recovery. Because it's supposed to bring businesses back.
Cool.
I like it. They're still around today, aren't they?
I know, it actually benefited towards something useful program to use today.
So what was this program intended to
Really formed.
Well, or unemployed, so unemployed, they are for Americans, so.
Yeah. And
General natural.
Yes, you did.
Not fair.
I do put you on the first half.
I don't think it's very successful.
This program was intended
when.
I'd say it provided more. Speaking of work, I'm in there.
I think
I would say that everyone provided more price for necessity. Still used today. But they actually, jobs they were doing. Prepared with.
we could just think.
Yeah,
it almost could be relief because it gave us So we're putting that under what?
I think it was this program.
Yeah, I think it was more relief because it gave us. We got money. We wasn't. Because recovery was so big growth and revive the economy and some stuff. And relief was providing immediate assistance or a monetary.
Yes, right now.
So I think it's.
So I'm working on. Yes, and it's food, money.
It gave people jobs. Jobs.
Prices took
No,
off.
it's connected Oh, yeah, downstairs.
I can hear.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm still on here. I think it's successful because it's provided jobs. Recovery is the most growth.
Yeah.
And explain.
Same answer I have too.
Yeah, they provided.
Me, I was just like, do you think it still exists today? No.
You can say you're successful.
And they had immediate
No.
success.
I
don't know, I just couldn't remember, so I just carried it.
The pricing.
I think it provided immediate relief. How successful do you think this program is? But you know, it was successful. Yeah, it gave a
Very successful. Yeah, we still use it.
We have 3 more minutes.
Oh, I know that. And going,
I'm just still around for this. Number 2, I have
I hate to say this, but I'm kind of grateful. Yes. I know it sounds horrible. I know I'm kind of grateful for what happened because of what we have and we have. Either that's first time and money and resources, and still I say has that. Because everybody cares. Yeah, so it kind of makes America acknowledge things that were needed. Helping. In a way, I hate to say, I know it's kind of glad.
See that as wrong themselves to make.
I see where the Great Depression is a problem, but I also see where it's a help.
well, the Great Depression, the CCC of America to realize that promoting the economy
There's national parks, so there's no immigrants that's falling.
I hear what you're saying, it's kind of like a necessity, like that had not happened, right, they may not have. There's one thing that we've learned is which is when you're surrounded by things, you really start to really use basic necessities, the downright nitty gritty, yeah, living. And then when it finally rolls back around, it's just so say that's growth. It forces you back to the basics. If it was never a problem, if it this would never have been. So yeah, that's my answer. And then for the last one, it does, but not to the extent that
I don't know how. Yeah, that was. How it was advertised. I know I've seen like people driving the highway.
it's more voluntary now. I don't know if a lot of people.
And it is
really volunteer about it.
Agency, but along those lines, because they didn't, I don't think they required degrees or anything.
No. But these people in a way kind of, I mean, they had other places to go that could have. I mean, you have nothing. Yeah, I don't know enough about the voluntary aspects of it to answer six. I don't know.
Why was
Okay, so if you want to stay where you're at, you can, or if you want to go back to your traditional seats, you may do that as well. Wherever you are most comfortable.
Love it.
But let's talk about these programs. Okay, so the first program was the Civilian Conservation Corps. Tell me a little bit about the CCC.
So it was created to help men and women kind of like have food and shelter and jobs and stuff like that. And to initially just give them like a foundation to build upon. It intended to help those people, but also to restore forests, beaches, and parks. We said that it fell under relief because they're helping the people with food, money, and shelter.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it was we believe it was successful because it provided immediate relief.
Okay.
That's what it was meant to do.
Okay. Yeah, so it provides like almost near immediate relief for the people. 2.5 million unmarried men initially, and then expanded to 8,500 women. And it gets them out of the despair that they're in and gives them a job right away. And this job, in fact, leads not only to relief for these individuals, but it helps to beautify local areas. And for example, Skyline Drive, many of the stone walls that are lining Skyline Drive are initially CCC projects. So we see actual results from this in this area. Hang on one second, Jimmy. All right, so did you feel that this program fell on, you said relief? How successful you said it was? How does it help to add to your understanding of the Great Depression?
It made us understand that America was very desperate and they needed some help quick, because if not, they were just going to keep plummeting. This was kind of like the finger in the dam, so to speak, to keep it from going all the way. And yeah, we didn't know if it still existed today, does it?
Okay, so it does not. It was only in existence from 1934 to 1937, but does anybody know of any present day programs that are similar to this?
The National Parks Association?
Well, the National Park Service is a federal agency, and that's more of like once you have a degree in training, you can go into that. But how many of you any of you ever heard of Job Corps? Okay, so Job Corps exists. It mainly targets students that are struggling in a traditional high school setting. And so what Job Corps allows them to do is to go to a location. The closest location to here is in Roanoke, and they receive room and board, and they get assistance completing their high school diploma, and then they get on-the-job training for fields like nursing, welding, automotive, and they actually earn a stipend while they're in the program for the hours that they're working. And it's not much. It's kind of similar to the $1 a day back then, but it allows them to spend money on things for themselves. And then after a certain period of time, they graduate from Job Corps, and then they go out into the workforce with a prescribed set of skills. And like for nursing, for example, you can come out of Job Corps with your LPN. So it's a really great program. Kate?
I think like I did something I guess was similar through Office on Youth.
Okay.
They had a program for kids to go and like get a job. So like I worked for Wilson Memorial High School where I graduated from, and I was just like their office receptionist, and Office on Youth paid me and not Wilson. So I know there was a bunch of other kids that did that. They went to like fast food restaurants, and instead of the restaurants paying them, Office on Youth paid them. It was like $6 an hour, and it wasn't taxed or anything, but
it's still an opportunity, yeah. So they probably paid the taxes for you, and that's one way that they can help you get a leg up. Jimmy.
Yes. So I did notice in this bottom photograph that the brick gully or storm drain they're building, if you walk around Gypsy Hill Park in Stanton, there are those drains, those gullies everywhere.
Yes.
So most likely that part was probably renovated during this, during the run of this.
Excellent observation. Yeah. And I'm not super familiar with this area and the impact of the CCC, but I bet if you researched a little bit on Gypsy Hill, it like very likely was. So thank you for sharing that. All right, group 2. Who's my group 2? All right, down front here. Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Tell me about that. Not the American Automobile Association. Not that AAA.
Intended to help farmers.
Okay.
And basically, it was like, it worked with like the law of supply and demand. So lower the supply to increase the demand, which would raise prices.
Okay.
And so the thought was, I guess, to kill off certain farm animals and crops, make the demand go higher.
Okay. Relief, recovery, or reform?
We said recovery.
Excellent.
It's a program to help expand.
Yeah, and restart, rejuvenate that particular part of the economy. Successful?
We said it wasn't very successful because since the prices were continuously being raised, many people didn't have enough money to afford them.
Mm-hmm. And how did this help to add to your understanding of the Great Depression?
It kind of showed that like they were willing to do like anything to improve.
Yeah, and FDR says that right from the start, even during his campaign. He says, I have these ideas, and not all of the remedies are going to work. We're not going to find success in every one, but we're going to try a bunch of different stuff and see what will help, because we don't quite know how to fix this patient.
So this was viewed as not successful?
It was viewed to many as not successful because, as Mackenzie noted, the prices were going up. The people in the rest of the country still didn't have the money to pay for it. And the fact that they were killing livestock and in many cases wasting it and wasting crops, people thought that that was an abomination. And the program was later deemed to be unconstitutional because the Supreme Court said that the government did not have the right to like kill off people's livestock and crops, even though they were pseudo giving permission to do it, that it was just so wasteful. And so obviously it doesn't exist anymore today. But do you know of any programs like it that exist? Did anything come to mind?
We Googled and it said that it was reinstated in 1938 and that portions of it still exist.
Mm-hmm.
So like I think about like in Virginia, like dairy farmers, no one's really encouraged anymore to own a dairy farm because it's very hard. Plus two, keeping the supply of milk down actually keeps the milk prices up, which helps the current dairies in Virginia.
Yeah.
Because if there were more dairies, then it would water down the milk price. So that's why we pay like 2 or 3 something a gallon, which is, kickback goes to the dairy farmer, but they have a hard time surviving even at that price.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's subsidies that are given to dairy farmers.
So no one's really encouraged right now to try to operate a dairy. It's just,
Poultry is the way to go.
yeah.
I was under the impression that the lack of dairy farms would mean that the price of milk should be at like $8 or $10, but because of the government subsidies, it's at $2.
The government subsidies are helping keep the prices low for the consumer,
Okay.
not like, so that the farmer is still making money. So,
Right, because if there wasn't the subsidy to keep the price low and the farmers could charge what they want to make a profit, it would be much higher.
in a simplistic form.
I know a dairy farmer in the way I understand. I mean, I grew up on a farm and not dairy, but the cost of farming and equipment keeps rising, but they're not getting any more money for their milk produced. So
Right.
they're not making money.
Because the government, if you take a government subsidy, then you can only sell your milk for so much.
Yeah, so they really can't
Yeah, that's,
compensate for the high cost of the equipment
yeah,
that they needed to produce.
yeah.
And if they did compensate for it, they have to raise prices.
Right, yeah, and so it's a really vicious
So a
cycle.
lot of dairies are going out of business because of that reason.
Yeah,
They just can't afford or make any money out of it.
yeah, because with the government, you're basically like shaking hands with the devil to keep in business, but then you're bound by certain restrictions, which include what you're permitted to sell your milk for. So it's a really challenging.
Yeah, like
issue.
Rockingham County is the largest agricultural county in Virginia, but you can count the dairies now on one hand.
Yeah.
It's very sad.
Yeah.
By doing that, doesn't that kind of stun competition?
Yes.
Yes, the theory.
So it's like anti-capitalist.
It is, yeah, it is to an
Roundabout
extent.
way.
The thought is that, yes, I mean, that's the simple answer. It is a more, to say socialistic is extreme and inaccurate, but if you have like two sides and on one side is capitalism and on one side socialism, it's definitely more on that side of it. But the government's theory behind it is that if you are restricting supply, you are then driving up prices and demand, like, because you still have demand. And so they view it as like they're assisting farmers. And if the price of the subsidies rose with inflation, it would be a successful system for the farmers that did exist. But it's like everything else, it's just not being run probably as best as it can.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, all right, good questions. Okay, the NRA or NIRA, National Industrial Recovery Act, not to be confused with the National Rifle Association. Jimmy, your group had this one, right?
Yes, that is correct. So the program was intended to help businesses because the decline in industrial prices caused massive business failures and huge unemployment. So the program was intended to boost declining prices and helping the businesses and supposedly the workers. The way they did that was by making trade associations in many industries that could write codes regulating their wages, their costs, and their prices to keep the price up. The codes did stop the tailspin of prices for a short time. The problem was, and this is where I'm going to get into whether it was not very successful. Oh, wait. I'm sorry, I'm skipping stuff.
That's right.
I'm doing things out of order.
You got 1 and 2, and so obviously this program is what?
Not successful.
Not successful, but is it relief, recovery, or reform?
Recovery.
Okay, and that's
Because
in the name,
it was intended, that was because it was intended to keep businesses from failing.
correct?
It was intended to bring them back from the brink.
Mhm.
The issue was when the recovery started to slowly uptick and wages began to rise. The problem was due to the codes, they raised prices much faster than the wages rose. So people were like, I can't buy anything now. And it slumped again. Like there was a relapse in the Depression in about 35, 36, partially because of this. It basically set up the same, all similar scenarios to what caused it in the first place, other than the stock market crash, was the falling wage, was prices rising much faster than wages.
So we're all going to be shocked to imagine that there is such a thing as too much governmental regulation, right? All right. So thank you guys. All right. Group 4, FDIC.
So the FDIC was formed to help businesses and to get their money back for what they lost.
Okay.
And the program intended was basically like insurance. It was relief because a lot of people were happy that they were getting their money back. They're getting up to $2,500.
A lot of money back then.
You also said it was also reform as well, because it actually prevents it from ever happening again. So if you have money, the bank has their money insured by the government. So if you hit another depression, at least you would get your $100,000. It's $250,000 now, but at least you can have that money back.
So it's really a reform program, because the relief part, it's not retroactive. It only, when it starts on January 1st, 1934, it's from that point forward. And it does still exist today. So if you guys have ever seen like a mortgage commercial, they'll be like FDIC, Equal Housing Lender, and that's Federal Deposit Insurance Company. I believe, I don't have my checkbook on me, but like if you look at your checks, I think the little like left-hand corner has an FDIC symbol on the checks. Tyler's agreeing with me. And so it's still in existence today. And as the guys pointed out, you're now insured up to $250,000. So what was happening prior to this is that people had deposited money in the banks, and then when the banks failed because they weren't getting their loans paid back, then they couldn't give people their money. So a quick crash course in how banking works, in case you didn't know and just blindly put your money in the bank, which most of us just kind of do. When you go to the bank and you deposit your $100, your personal $100 does not actually stay in that bank. Because what happens is if I go and I deposit $100 tomorrow, and then Jasmine comes in tomorrow and asks for a $100 loan, they give Jasmine that loan. And then the way the bank makes money is the bank charges Jasmine interest on that loan. Now, meanwhile, JT comes in, she puts her $100 in the bank so that on Friday, when I go to withdraw $100 or $50 or whatever, there's money there. So the bank is constantly taking money in, but then making loans on the money that it's taking in so that it too can make money. It doesn't just keep your money in an account out of the goodness of its heart. And so what happened during the onset of the Great Depression was that everybody panicked and was like, oh my gosh, the bank is going to run out of money. And they all went and quick withdrew their money from the bank. And then, of course, there was money out on loans that people weren't paying back quick enough. And so therefore, like literally people lost their money because the bank didn't get it back. And so what this did is it to ensure people trusting in the system of banking again, it insured initially up to $2,500, which was a lot of money back then. That if something would, if the bank would fail, that you could get your money back. The federal government would insure your money. And now today it's up to $250,000. But as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been a real bank failure since the Great Depression. Okay. Works Progress Administration. My crew down front here. Tell me about the WPA.
Okay, so this was a program that was intended to help the unemployed of America, the poor, if you will. And it did so by the restoration of schools, hospitals, it built roads, highways, things like that, things that, in my honest opinion, America needed. Or there was a demand for, at least, because even the Ed Puzzle said people wanted new roads and highways.
That is true.
As far as does the program fall under, okay, for this one, in economic terms, you could say it fell under relief. we put recovery, I think I was thinking more along the lines of helping America as a whole to fill the demand
That is
that
correct.
people wanted. So I think in a way it could fall under either one of those two. How successful, I'd say, I'd have to say it's very successful. I mean, we still use a lot of the stuff that they built even today. So I'd say it was a very successful investment. And then for the, how does this program add to your understanding of the Great Depression? For this one, you probably heard me. For this one, this is going to sound kind of mean, but in a way, I'm kind of grateful that there was kind of a drop simply because it kind of forced America to work on those things that were, what's the word I'm trying to say? I don't think very much attention would have been paid to recreational things or construction or repairing if this hadn't happened, because everybody was so blinded and clouded by money and things and entertainment. And I think if this hadn't have happened, we wouldn't have what we have today. Or if we did have it, it definitely wouldn't have happened at a fast pace as it did today, or to the extent. So in a way, I'm kind of grateful that there was, you know, something that forced people back to putting attention into repairs and recoveries and highways and things like that, because it's something that, again, we still use today. Although at the other hand, I don't envy the people that were born.
No, I get exactly what you're saying. And like Sharon said, you know, this stuff was neglected up to this point. One of the other interesting things, those of you guys that have had me for 121 or may have me for 121 in the future, you guys might remember the slave narratives that we listened to. And those slave narratives were collected as a result of a Works Progress Administration project. So the WPA not only hired people to do physical labor, but they also hired them to do cultural and artistic and historical pursuits. So they paid people to go out into communities in the Deep South and interview individuals who at that point in time were quite old, who had lived under slavery. And so, and sharecropping and things like that. So some of the testimonies that we have of the, you know, of that, you know, Civil War antebellum period are a direct result of the WPA project. So there's a lot of really interesting things that came about as a result of the WPA. WPA isn't still around, but during the last recession, one of the things that made me connect with the WPA is, like, you might have seen, God, some of you guys were like 5 years old at that point. But you might have seen signs that were like putting Americans to work when you were driving on the highway, and there were a lot of highway construction projects, because in 2009, Obama passed a highway bill, and that helped to like rejuvenate construction on infrastructure and federal roadways. And when I saw those signs back then, like, it made me think of like the WPA and how it was providing, you know, money for our infrastructure for jobs. All right, Social Security. Nobody here's probably ever heard of this program, so I'll let our group in the back tell us about
it. So, who the program intended to help, obviously pension for old age workers, the ones who retired, victims of industrial accidents, unemployment insurance, which was one of the main focuses for the unemployed, dependent mothers, and the physically disabled. So what is the program intended to do? One of the main focuses, as I just said, is we looked it up on Google too, because this doesn't really give that much information, that it was really to help out the unemployed. That was. And when you think about Social Security nowadays, the only thing you really think about is pensions once you're retired. So in between, whether it was relief or reform.
In this case, it was both. And here's a little bit of, you're on the right track. So let's think about this a little bit more deeply. All right. Back then, there was no government-sponsored old age pension. So if you didn't personally save money in your own account in a bank that hopefully didn't fail or under your mattress, you wouldn't have money to retire with. And so the reality was that most people worked until they were dead or until they were too sick to work, because most people didn't save money, or especially after the collapse of the banks, money that they had saved was no longer available to them. So you are back then, let's say, a 55-year-old human being. You have lost your retirement savings, but you still have a job. You're going to keep working in that job. But what that's going to do is you're going to be occupying a position that a younger worker could fill if you were able to retire. So in a way, it's relief or even recovery, because it's getting the older people out of the workforce to provide jobs for the younger people who are currently unemployed, yet providing the older people with a safety net. And so that was why Social Security was conceived, was to get people, older people, out of the workforce to provide openings for younger people who were then paying into the system that would support the older people. Question?
So when it was signed, how did it actually help?
Because the government provided the seed money to get payments to, like, hey, you're gonna retire tomorrow, we promise you a pension. So like the government, like they provided money for the infrastructure, jobs and things like that, they're providing the seed money for Social Security. So where Social Security has gotten complicated over the years, and by the way, there's other ways you can collect Social Security. If you are orphaned, you can draw from Social Security until you're 18, because it's, you know, basically perceived that your parent paid into Social Security, so then you can draw on their pension to support you until you're 18. Or if you're widowed, and if you're widowed, you can draw on your spouse's Social Security if it is greater than your Social Security, but you can't draw both. You have to like pick whose payment you're going to get. And then if you are disabled, you can also draw from Social Security. But where Social Security got into a problem and why it's been a hot button political topic is for a period of time, the government was actually, when the economy was doing better, the government was actually like borrowing money from the Social Security fund to pay for other things that were not connected to Social Security. And then they didn't pay it back. And so it created essentially a deficit within Social Security, which was then further exacerbated by the baby boomer generation retiring in much larger numbers than like jobs are influxing in to pay for their Social Security. So that's why, you know, next year, I'm sure during the presidential election, we'll hear about Social Security, because it always seems to come up, because it's an issue that we haven't quite solved yet. Yes, ma'am.
So would the whole, I know this sounds weird, but would the whole like food stamp situation in WIC, would that fall under it as well as like because a lot of more of that is going out than is coming in.
So food stamps are a relief, like a present day relief organization. We're going to tackle that, not next week, but the following week. So I'm going to have you hold that question until then, because it's a really good question, but I want us to hold it until then. So, all right. So those are our attempts, our remedies. If you guys want to head back to your regular seat, we're going to talk a little bit more about them. Okay, so one of the very first things that FDR does in his very first, what we call fireside chat, he announces a bank holiday. And that bank holiday is literally where all the banks in the nation are closed. And he implores the American people to once again put their trust in the banking system. Don't keep hiding your money under the mattress, because that's not going to stimulate recovery. Put your money back into the banks. And here are some of the ways that we're going to help you protect it. He passes the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which helps to also further reassure Americans in the validity of banks. He works with Congress to pass that. And he's successful. His fireside chat, his radio address, where people literally are sitting in their homes listening to him, reassure them that everything is going to be okay, is successful. And Roosevelt will actually make fireside chats a frequent part of his presidential administration. Congress then follows up with the Economy Act, which grants the executive branch the power for the first time to cut government salaries, to also help to get government spending under control. And during his first 100 days in power, he works with Congress to put forth and pass 15 separate proposals. And so that's where the whole concept of like what you can accomplish in your first 100 days comes about. Unlike other presidents who had previously kind of waded in and seen where things were, FDR jumps in with a plan. He passes the Beer and Wine Act, which reauthorizes the sale of beer and wine, and will ultimately lead to the passage of the 21st Amendment, which will repeal prohibition, the only constitutional amendment ever created that ruled out another constitutional amendment. Easy way to remember this, I may or may not have said this last week. If I did, I apologize, is that you can't drink at 18, but you can at 21. And that's an easy way to remember those two amendments. So in the end, the banking crisis is over. The economy is minimally starting to restabilize. It still has a long way to go. The regulatory power of the Federal Reserve is extended. And he also puts forth some policies that help to address both farm issues and farm loans, as well as loans for homeowners. So relief for those in debt on mortgages to try and help them get back on track. And of course, the programs that we discussed, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, those are all part of that relief component. So that is relief. Next, we have recovery. And of course, the biggest attempt that FDR makes towards recovery is to support a series of programs like the National Recovery Act, which will hopefully jumpstart the economy. Some are successful, some components of it are successful, but particularly as Tracy's group and Jimmy's group illuminated, these are not outright successes and successes without other problems behind them. But they are attempts to help both agriculture recover and industry recover. And then along the way, to institute opportunities for regional planning and infrastructure to help various localities grow. We then have the issue with the Dust Bowl. I'm going to play this short little video for you to illuminate the situation that farmers are facing as they're attempting to recover. So it is an audio of a fireside chat that tells us about the Dust Bowl.
Oh, yes. PR love that.
1934.
That apparently has been replaced by a video about the Dust Bowl.
Dust storms hit New York, Chicago, and Boston. Ships stop off the eastern seaboard, unsure what is happening. Dust storms were born out of a 100 million acre dead zone, 2,000 miles away in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. The Great Plains had once been the most fertile grasslands on Earth. The topsoil was 6 feet deep. It has been plowed up and used up by 4 generations of farmers. Now, the sun has dried it up.
What really did the farmers in was an environmental cataclysm that involved extended drought, high winds, and the loss of millions and millions of tons of topsoil.
By 1930, the rains virtually stopped. Then a freakish phenomenon happens. Static electricity builds between the earth and the dust. Like a magnet, the static electricity sucks up more and more dust, feeding itself, growing in size and power. A monster is created. The dust is lifted up to 10,000 feet. Powered by high-altitude winds, the monster rips across the country looking for prey. The cold front drives the storm south across the prairies at 65 miles per hour. It grows more and more powerful, produces enough static electricity to power New York City. People tie themselves to ropes before going to a bar just a few hundred feet away. Cattle die when they are cut open. Stomachs are full of sand. By 1936, farmers are losing $25 million a day.
Farming is no longer a possibility. The Great Depression takes hold. Their mortgage comes due. They can't pay it. They're not growing crops. They lose the family farm. They lose their identity.
A century before, 500,000 people had gone west on these same trails looking for hope. Now, 250,000 of them are fleeing the Dust Bowl in despair.
And so that too is going to contribute to the situation in urban areas because that's where they're fleeing. And there's no jobs, there's no opportunities there as well. And so this simultaneous situation really creates a struggle. And so you have, this is the fireside chat clip. I'm going to actually save that and I'll post it online for you guys just for the sake of time. But FDR takes a trip out there. And he wants to hear firsthand from these people what kind of support they need, in addition to the debt relief programs that he's hoping that Congress will continue in order to help them get a handle. So this is the first phase of the New Deal. Moving into 1935, it becomes evident that the New Deal needs some revision. And it's not, you know, a wholesale success. In fact, there were elements within FDR's own party who challenged major components of it, particularly the AAA and the NRA. Much of the success of the initial New Deal actually can be attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, who really championed the cause in the public eye and spoke to a lot of newspapers and tried to get word out about the programs. And really also works to extend the programs into African-American communities throughout the country so that they're aware of these opportunities as well. And you saw in that one video clip earlier, you know, that there were specific opportunities that were created for African-American communities as part of these relief and recovery programs. So the New Deal isn't just an outright success, and it's recognized that it needs to be relaunched. And so FDR plans the second New Deal, 1935, 1936, obviously going into an election year. And, you know, he is starting to see programs being ruled unconstitutional. He's starting to get challenges within his own political party, which you'll read more about at home this week. But, you know, ultimately, moving into 1936, he begins to see some additional successes. And that is, of course, most notably with the passage of the Social Security Act in 1935, and then the continued success of some of the programs like the FDIC, and the passage of what is known as the Revenue Act of 1935. And the Revenue Act once again starts to raise taxes on those in higher income brackets. So we start to see more brackets once again added to the income tax system. Unfortunately, Roosevelt is still struggling with the Supreme Court. And it is as a result of these struggles, and you'll read more extensively about this as well at home in your reading this week, that he attempts one of the most controversial things during his first 8 years in office, and that is something that becomes known as the court packing scheme or court packing scandal. At the time of the New Deal, there were 9 justices on the Supreme Court, as there are still today. And what FDR was proposing was that Congress would add up to 6 new Supreme Court justices, making the total 15. Congress theoretically at any time could do that even today. Why FDR was pushing for it was at that time he perceived 5 of the justices to be conservative and 4 of them to be liberal. The 4 liberal ones consistently supported his agenda. The 5 conservative ones typically did not. He felt that if he added additional justices, that he would then sway the court over in his direction. But public outcry against this was substantial. I'm sure you're not surprised. And finally, one of the conservative justices resigned, and FDR was able to replace him with a liberal justice, once again securing support for future programs. But before that happened, interestingly enough, the court did support both the Wagner Act and the Social Security Act. The conservative court did uphold Social Security, and they also upheld the Wagner Act, which was an act that supported organized labor. Heading into the election of 1936, with this situation brewing around him, Roosevelt initially is worried that he is going to have to fight off individuals from within his own political party for the nomination. And that does not actually come to pass, but many individuals from within the Democratic Party begin to leave the Democratic Party and head towards the Republican Party. As a result of disagreements over FDR's New Deal policy. And it's really here, leading into 1936, that we begin to see what will ultimately focus on a basically inversion of the 2 political parties in America. And so previously, the values that had been upheld by Democrats are now beginning to intermingle with Republicans. Because there is dissension over New Deal policies. FDR ultimately runs against a gentleman by the name of Alfred Landon, who is pictured here on the right. He is able to hold off Landon and be reelected for a second term. And while his second term is not without its challenges, which we're certainly going to delve more deeply into in just a moment, we do see that, in the second term, while there is a slump in 1937, other things are occurring on the economic realm that do help to solidify and stabilize the American economy. Labor unions are on the rise. The AFL and CIO are the 2 predominant labor unions at this time in history, and they're supported by that previously mentioned Wagner Act.
And you said these items help stabilize the economy?
Yes, they do help to stabilize the economy, despite the brief slump in 37. The rise in labor unions once again begins to put rights of the American worker at not necessarily the forefront, but at least in an elevated position versus, being so far below, like, we need to fix the economy, we'll make you work in any conditions. The economy is recovering enough that laborers can say, we want jobs, but you can't mistreat us. And so the Wagner Act really helps to support that. And then in 1938, the last of the New Deal comes forth. The new, as Tracy mentioned, the Agricultural Adjustment Act is brought back. We also start to see another Housing Act. And we also see the establishment of what at that time is called the U.S. Housing Authority, which today is part of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is where HUD begins its life. So in the end, the legacy of the New Deal is that the Democratic Party is fragmented. There is a brief and new Red Scare because people think that FDR is a commie. Because he's proposing these programs. We also begin to see the rise of what we call the broker state, where the federal government is dabbling more intensely with regulation of business and the economy. which also leads to the creation of more governmental offices. So we have a larger national government. And we also, as we're going to see as we get into the second half of class tonight, how we've been focusing so much on domestic policy at the expense of foreign policy. And that's obviously going to lead to some difficult scenarios. So again, these notes are all in Classroom. or in a Canvas. I am going to pause the live feed here for a moment because I want to show you guys a video before we take the break.